Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Cathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakari Chapman
and me, Tova Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America. My name is Janine Turner. Welcome to Constitutional Chats. Our hot topic for today is Amendment 18 and 21, which is prohibition and the repeal thereof. And our special constitutional scholar is, back by popular demand, Professor Gordon Lloyd. And we're so excited to have him. Professor Gordon Lloyd is going to shed his brilliance on this, so it's going to be a fascinating topic, even though it seems sort of obvious. You know, people were drinking and they were drinking too much and we told them not to drink. And then we realized we couldn't tell them to drink and then we reversed it. But still, it's much more interesting than that. It's because Professor Gordon Lloyd is going to tell us about the story of America. But first, my co-president of Constituting America, the co-president of Constituting America, the one and only Cathy Gillespie, who's been one of the few prestigious citizens to be chosen to be a part of the 250th anniversary of America's birth. And she's a former CEO on the Hill, so she's quite the wonderful, wondrous Cathy Gillespie. Cathy, you want to tell us about our terrific sponsor for today?
Yes, thank you, Janine. Thank you for that introduction. Our sponsor today, and we thank her and her husband very much, is Jamie Radke and her husband, John. Jamie and John are from Virginia, and Jamie has been a longtime supporter of Constituting America, has helped us over the years, not only with generous gifts, but with advice, helping us spread the word, has even helped us book some school speeches. So Jamie and John, thank you for sponsoring today's Constitutional Chat.
Hey, thank you. All righty, I want to introduce Tova Love Kaplan, the one and the only, oh, so amazing Tova Love Kaplan, who is our 3-time winner of our Constituting America contest. Please check it out at constitutingamerica.org. She's also the National Youth Advisor for Constituting America, which she runs like a top 100 company as a CEO. Ladies and gentlemen, our future Secretary of State or President of the United States, Tova Love Kaplan.
Thank you so much, Janine. You have hands down the best introductions, but thank you all so much for being here, and we hope you really enjoy the show.
And Dakari is busy auditioning today, so he's not with us. The wonderful Dakari, our student youth ambassador, 2-time winner of our contest. All right, now, drum roll, please. The Professor Gordon Lloyd is the Robert and Catherine Doxson Professor of Public Policy at Pepperdine University, my alma mater, by the way. He is the co-author of 3 books on the American founding and sole author of a book on the political economy of the New Deal. And he is the creator, with the help of the Ashbrook Center, of 4 highly regarded websites on the origin of the Constitution. Professor Gordon Lloyd earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in Economics and Political Science at McGill University. He completed all the coursework toward a doctorate in economics at the University of Chicago before receiving his Master of Arts and PhD degrees in government at Claremont Graduate School. Back by popular demand, we had the most Professor, we don't even mention it here. You've written essays for our 90-day study, I believe, but also you've been on our show before, and you were on 2 weeks ago, and you're back by popular demand because you're just so mesmerizing. So, truly, mesmerizing is a word for you. Okay, so talk to us about the 18th and 21st amendments, and then we will all pepper you with questions. Okay, Professor Gordon Lloyd, you're on.
Okay. For those of you who are followers of Constituting America, one piece of extra reading I would suggest would be the chat that we had 2 weeks ago, because the 2 weeks ago chat on 2 amendments and the chat we're having today on 2 amendments constitute a package. And the package is part of the American story. So that what I did last time was to suggest that there's an opening package of a conversation, and that gets settled with the attachment of the Bill of Rights. Then we've got the slavery issue and its quote resolution unquote with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And then we get these progressive amendments. And one of the good questions that was asked by our student was, did the progressives propose any other amendments that were rejected? And part of the problem of answering that is that an amendment is not usually proposed until it's almost assured of passing. Almost. I mean, there are a lot of amendments which have been proposed which have not passed. But part of using the amendment route is, one, to get the deliberate sense of the community, two, to not simply rely on the immediate vote of some politicians that will pass something through the ages, but three, to get the sense of the people on a vital issue so that you can amend the Constitution. The purpose of amending is to correct errors or bring it up to date, but you just don't bring it up to date by what the court says. So that is a part of a background, namely that the progressive movement had these four, they had other ideas, a lot of them, which made its way into American politics, but not necessarily through the amendment mode, but through other ways of settling disputes. And so so that's the background. What we want to do today is to look at these two, what we would call odd amendments. What is odd about the 18th Amendment on prohibition is that we usually associate it with the word alcohol. But the word alcohol is never mentioned in the 16th Amendment. So we have to infer. The language is intoxicating liquors. So now what is an intoxicating liquor? And obviously it depends on your size, your weight, how much of this, that, the other, as to whether you become intoxicated. So is it you becoming intoxicated, which makes the liquor intoxicating liquor? Or is there something in the liquor which makes it intoxicating, even if you don't get intoxicated? So the language, as you see it now, good for you, reading the actual words. And this is what I love about Constituting America. It encourages you to actually read what is there and then sit back and think about it. So it says intoxicating liquors. All right. Now, so that's what it is. Also an amendment that took, I think, about a year to pass, and which means that there's probably a broad acceptance towards such an amendment in the public already. That's what I was getting at. When you get, if you're going to go the amendment route, which requires 2/3 and 3/4, you've got to build momentum and keep that momentum for some time. So going into the conversations about the 18th Amendment, 23 out of the 48 states had already had state and local laws concerning the consumption, manufacture, and sale of intoxicating liquors. So what you need, if you're at that stage with 23, what you need is 13 more. 36. You need 36 out of 48 to get the thing passed. So do you have 13 more votes? Well, you're willing to take the chance to go that route rather than get defeated, because if you get defeated on an amendment, it becomes extremely difficult to reintroduce it. It's almost like one chance and you're done. So that's one thing, that there was a fairly widespread acceptance that liquor, intoxicating liquor, should be regulated. When did this start? one might say, well, usually there's always a kind of money involved. Yes. But a lot of American movements don't just start with money. They start with an objection, an idea, make the world perfect, change the world. We are one, we are clean, those kinds of things. I mean, I don't go to school just to get a degree, but to change the world or something like that, right? So there's in America, there are usually these movements have, particularly progressive movements, have some version or view of progress. And the temperance movement has been around in America since the founding, but it wasn't strong at the founding. The founders drank, and they were, yeah. And this notion that the Pilgrims didn't drink is a bit of a myth. I think the real growth of this movement, or of temperance, which actually is rather an interesting name for the movement because it's rather intemperate. It's demanding an end to things, which is not what I would call temperate or moderation or compromising. They know the truth, and it grew out of religious revival in the early 1800s in America, and then it grew and sort of morphed into the abolitionist movement. And there's a lot of that kind of thinking with regard to the temperance movement after the Civil War. There's a lot of thinking that this is the next step, in the progressive step, the next step after the abolition of slavery. Right? That alcohol is the sin of the late 19th century. And so we must do unto alcohol what we have done unto slavery, which means that the movement is now becoming national, as the progressives do. They've got a following in religion, and they've got a following in reform movements at the local level, because the number the amount of misbehavior, particularly by men, and the home, leaving women with great difficulties to run the family. All more from, and it moved from the private sector, where the sort of nonprofits, what we would call nonprofits, church groups, would take care of these things. It moved into the level of government. If it's so good to do these kinds of reforms, why make it voluntary? Because voluntary means I'm in one day and I'm out the next. I have to make it required. So instead of looking for a more perfect union, they're looking for a perfect union. And the idea of perfection is abolition, the abolition of slavery, and the abolition now of intoxicating liquors, on the ground that intoxicating liquors brings about bad behavior, so bad that we cannot tolerate a diversity in the land. That's this, here you can drink, here you can't drink, you can drink in this, etc. So I think that's the background. So I give you one background. There's all of these attempt to amend the Constitution as a bundle. The second is that the 18th Amendment is part of a story, just didn't jump out at us. It's part of a story of the 19th century trying to rectify ills. And the consumption of intoxicating liquor was viewed by the progressives as an ill on society that needed to be eradicated, because it creates all kinds of problems. Go to the root, don't just control the effects, go to the cause. And it had widespread, just like a number of progressive ideas. And so the progressives decided to go and find an amendment. In those days, doing this kind of public policy, which was a fundamental change, virtually across the land, is you've got to have an amendment to the Constitution if you're going to do something so fundamental. Today, you rely on a Supreme Court decision, or you rely on an executive order, or you rely on such and such to make change. So that we don't have these kind of stories of amendments to help us in the late 20th or 21st century. What we have to do is study executive orders, et cetera, and judicial decisions. But progressives are still operating within that old-fashioned American idea, even though they want to change the old-fashioned American idea, that if you want to have fundamental change, you need to amend the Constitution. So they needed to get 13 more states to amend, and they did. And part of the reason why they got the 13 more states is that they had this 23 states in their own laws had it, so that you're not asking the states to give up anything really much, because over half the states anyway, had already done this. We could read the language, and today, I think one would say, if you read the language, you just use the Interstate Commerce Clause. Article 1, Section 8 is commerce. Therefore, doesn't Congress already have control over it? Well, see, back in the late 19th century or early 20th century, that was still an argument over how far can you stretch, even among progressives, how far can you stretch the language of the Constitution to cover? So we get the passage of the 18th Amendment. And what is also interesting to me is this is the first time that a time limit, an expiration limit, is placed. So that if you look at the end of the 18th Amendment, at Section 3, the article shall be inoperative unless it shall have been ratified as an amendment by the legislature of the several states that provided within 7 years of the date of submission thereof to the states by Congress. So that is the first time. And I haven't done enough work to figure out why is this the first one to say, if you don't get the votes in 7 years, you got to start all over again. But this has happened. There's only one other thing that comes to mind with this is the Equal Rights Amendment for women. I mean, they've come extremely close to getting the various votes lined up in each state, but they've missed the deadline. And so another deadline has been placed, and you missed the deadline. And part of what has happened now is that it has watered down the enthusiasm. Why want to go again if what you get is you can't get it in 7 years? Then you can't. This is useless. So I think the three parts to the 18th Amendment is, one, what it says. It says intoxicating liquors, transportation, manufacture, sale. Now, it doesn't talk about consumption. Yeah, it says that manufacture, sale, or transportation shall be stopped. So there's a loophole there. So you must know that there's a heck of a lot of conversation behind the scenes going into the language of this 18th Amendment. No word about alcohol, nothing about consumption. That means that somehow if you grow it at home and you do it at home, you're in an area where you might be able to make an argument for yourself, because it's not exact. You're not manufacturing it for sale, and you're not going into interstate commerce. You're sitting home and having a good old homegrown brew. So Section 1, language concerning prohibition, of what it means. It means taking the control over, let's just say, alcohol out of the hands of the states and putting it in a national level to say one size fits all. Section 2 is that Congress shall have with the states shall have concurrent power to enforce. So you need a law in order to implement this amendment, and it's known as the Volstead Act, and which means that it's in Congress. Congress creates it. There's going to be all kinds of compromises and issues brought up, the Volstead Act, and that's where you get your lack of obedience. It's with the Volstead Act, because that has to be enforced. So it's not a question of, say, police going around enforcing the 18th Amendment. What they're doing is trying to enforce what Congress has done to put the 18th Amendment into effect. And there are loopholes in these laws. And therefore they're taken advantage of. And therefore an underground economy is created. And I keep remembering this. I never knew who Billy Sunday was, but Billy Sunday was a preacher. And Billy Sunday used to preach about the dangers of alcohol. And he made his target Chicago. And so there's a famous song that Sinatra sings, yeah, Chicago, this city that even Billy Sunday couldn't shut down. And so to today, you like the song, you like Sinatra, but that line doesn't make sense to us today because we're not in that historical era. But if you do the work, Billy Sunday was a preacher. And so Chicago gets its fame from being able to, Chicago ain't ready for reform. It's ready for Al Capone, but not Billy Sunday, which is just fascinating. And then the third section is that it shall be inoperative unless done within 7 years. It was done within 1 year, as it turns out. As you can see, it's December the 18th. It was introduced and ratified January the 16th, 1919, 1 year. Now, that's pretty darn quick to pass an amendment, even if you're given 7 years to pass it. 1 year. Bill of Rights took more than 1 year to pass. So, I know we need to start to have a conversation, but I wanted to respond to your point about laying out the story about how the 18th Amendment got its way and how it's actually. So let me move very quickly. Then, oh, by the way, you need 36 out of 48, and it passed so quickly because 46 out of 48 states agreed. Only 2 states did not. It was Connecticut and Rhode Island. But that's very quick, which means there was a knowledge on the part of the leaders that the votes were there. All right, let's talk about the 21st Amendment, which is repealing. Now, what's new or novel or distinctive about this? It becomes the second time that a time limit is placed on an amendment. That is that the folks who want to do away with prohibition have 7 years from the date of submission to undo it. And well, what did they manage to accomplish? They introduced the amendment in March of 1932, and it was passed in January of 1933. And that's pretty darn quick to overturn an amendment, which is, let's say, like 9 months. It was overturned. But what was the vote? The vote was, let's see, what I have it here. Oh, it passed, but 10 states never ratified it, which meant that 38 did, and you needed 36. So an interesting story here is, why did it pass so quickly when there is such an opposition? If you go through and you check through the amendments, all of them, and see, well, what was the opposition like? How many tallies did they put up? This is one of the biggest, to stop prohibition. So 10 states didn't want to do away with prohibition. They wanted to control prohibition in their own states. So and I think that's extremely important. Which means there is still a strong temperance movement. And today there's a strong temperance movement. I don't know what the figure is, so I'm going to go conservative on this. 1/3 of Americans today don't drink.
I don't drink. I'm one of those.
Okay. Well, I do drink, and I'm not
I
one
don't
of those.
drink either, guys.
What's
There
this?
you go. Tova doesn't drink. Yes.
No,
Okay, so I've got so many questions, but finish up here because once again, this is just
okay.
really fascinating.
So all right. So let me finish it. So this is an article which I've explained also has a time limit. There's a certain urgency to do away with it. And the reason for that is not necessarily a change in one's attitude, because it just by 2 votes, by 2 state votes, it got passed, right? So the urgency was there and a risk had to be taken. What was the problem? The problem was corruption. That the Volstead Act was so difficult to enforce that you had widespread corruption. Herbert Hoover thought it was a noble idea that Americans were engaged in. It was a noble experiment. Hoover was pretty much a teetotaler himself. But he, in the end, came out in favor of doing away with prohibition because he didn't see what was the sense in having a law that you couldn't enforce. So the Volstead Act was unenforceable. And that is and I think we need to bear that in mind. And the last point would be what is unique about this amendment is that it is the first and only amendment to be confirmed by a convention of the people. And it's so funny. I mean, the first the Prohibition Amendment was used the usual way of ratifying 3/4 of the state legislatures. This one was 3/4 of specially called state conventions in which the people were directly involved. And I find that absolutely fascinating. And there's a whole story behind that about progressivism and populism and all of that. But I think it's an example of the American story, which is if you're going to overturn an amendment, if you're going to overturn something by the deliberate sense of the community, you need to have the people directly involved in overturning that, and not just state legislatures which are elected by the people. You have to go more firmly and more accurately to the core principle of America, which is the consent of the governed under law. And so I think that we can wrap up our my long sort of prologue of these 2 amendments, and you go bashing away with questions. Go for it.
Okay. Oh my gosh, this is once again mesmerizingly interesting. Okay, I'm gonna just throw some things out and then land on a question, an observances first. Time. I still am a real proponent for amendments instead of Supreme Court decisions and instead of executive orders, because, well, as we're seeing now, and we've seen with executive orders, sometimes they're overturning duly legislated, public policy by the legislative, the congressional branch. These executive orders aren't, what I understand, executive orders are to overturn executive orders, but we're bleeding now into duly processed congressional laws are being executive, overturned. So it's that gets tricky, these executive orders and the courts. I like that it took time for people to think it through about actually passing an amendment. And I'm sorry to see that people don't understand the amendment process and they don't understand why it's important, and that they don't see it as a tool to use, because amendments, except for the 18th, usually really stay. They're not overturned by executive orders. They're not overturned by laws. They're very powerful, I think. I love, though, the way our founding fathers wanted us to be methodical about it. Let's see. I want to ask you, I'll get to the actual question in a minute. That's really, I want to do something, which is when you were on last time, there were about 4 to 6 states in the 16th Amendment, which were of course taxes, I believe, that did not, income tax on your income, that did not want it. I remember when I had that sticky here somewhere and I can't find it. I want to look into those, do a white paper or something, look into those states that didn't want it and why. I think that's really interesting. And now I think it's really interesting that 10 states did not agree to overturning prohibition. I think it's fascinating that it doesn't say you can't actually consume it. I never knew that. It just says manufacture, sale, or transportation. I come from a lineage of Texans, and way back, my great, he was making his own his own liquor, and he left stories about it. And then he tried to stop liquor, but it's fascinating then that the speakeasies were always arresting all those people when actually it wasn't even, they weren't the ones. They doesn't say they couldn't consume it. So I think that's really interesting. I guess I'm really curious about the 10 states that said no to overturning the 18th Amendment, because when I grew up, this will be news to Tova and Lisa, you couldn't get any, you had to go, we lived in dry district, and we're talking the 1960s and the 1970s. You had to actually drive to another district to be able to get booze, so to speak. So not that I was getting it, but I'm really curious if Texas were one of those states that didn't that kept their own state laws.
It was not. It ratified the amendment repealing the 21st.
It did.
There you go.
Yeah, ratified the 21st in 1933.
So what happened then? I guess that districts within the state still decided they wanted to prohibit alcohol in certain. So it just continued after 1933 that certain districts within the states said no.
I am on Wikipedia, so this is Wikipedia information, but it seems like there were several states that voted to repeal because they wanted to re-implement state and local control. I would venture to say that Texas was probably one of them.
Yeah, you see, there's an irony. Let me put the irony in a little story of my own. You've got your own story there. My irony was when I came to America and I was at the University of Chicago, I decided, well, I've heard a lot about American football, but I've never watched an American football game. So I'm going to watch the Bears, and it's on a Sunday, and the game was at 1. So I left the apartment and went to Walgreens to try to order a 6-pack. And it was 11 o'clock, and I couldn't purchase a 6-pack of beer on a Sunday in Chicago at 11 o'clock because they had a liquor control law which prohibited the sale of alcohol in public until noon. And my first reaction was, I thought prohibition was over. Why? I just don't understand this. But of course, prohibition wasn't over. What the 21st Amendment did in terms of abolishing the Prohibition Act was leave it now up to the states. The federal government was no longer going to be involved in controlling the manufacture, the sale, movement of alcohol, intoxicating liquors. It's not going to be completely state controlled. So that's why you can move from one state to another state, or even from one county to another county. I taught, my first teaching job was at age 23 at the University of Dallas. And I was there for 2 years. And Irving was a dry county, and Dallas and where the airport was at the time was a wet county. And so you get all kinds of industries and liquor stores growing up on one side, and preachers condemning it growing up on the other side. And it's a fascinating part of American life. And so the prohibition, overturning prohibition, didn't so much as introduce drinking, it introduced open drinking. But what it did was to get the feds out of the business of regulating. What the 18th Amendment did was remove What the 18th Amendment actually did was to prohibit the states from regulating their own internal liquor laws. And make that a federal case. So
Okay, so I want to turn it over to Tova because she has to go to school and let her ask her questions. That's really interesting. The whole national government versus state government. Who would have thought that the 18th, 21st would be this interesting? But I really find this to be incredibly interesting. But I just want to throw out before I hand it over to Tova is that I watched a Ken Burns documentary, I think it was, on Prohibition. And what it showed, which is interesting that he would show this, but just how devastating alcohol was at that time to the people. And I was thinking about 1919, you know, that was the Wild West and all the bars and all the violence and the guns and the men were just lying on the streets, intoxicated, and women were left alone to raise their children, or they're being terribly abused. There were brothels everywhere. And he laid it out about what America really looked like, which is hard for us to imagine. You know, brothels were probably, you know, on the East Coast, they were everywhere. So you had this sort of, it's interesting to think about the dichotomy in our minds, because we had the Quakers, the people that were very religious, you know, but then we also had this wildness going on. But it really, really affected the children and the women. And afterwards, the point they made in this documentary is that it was the wrong thing to do on so many levels, which is why it was overturned. And yet it did change America. After that, the brothels were shut down. There weren't as many drunk men in the streets. You know, it did help a lot of the families, the kids that were being orphaned and the wives that were being abused, or, you know, who's to say it wasn't flipped? The wives were abusing the husbands because they were getting drunk. I mean, you know, whatever.
Yeah, unlikely.
It was a really interesting sort of American story about how America, of course, you know, we still are drinkers and we still have violence and all this. But I mean, it was kind of, I think that happens in America a lot. There's a swing that takes things too drastically, and then America always seems to come back to a sense of reason and rationale. Okay, Tova, go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. So I was wondering if there was any connection between the temperance movements and the early feminist movements, since they both were kind of led by women and seem to originate around similar times. What do you say?
Yes. I mean, my quick answer, yes. It was fascinating that the women were involved with the abolitionist movement, which, let's say, goes from 1800 to 1865, when abolition occurred across the land. Prior to that, you had, you know, the prohibition of slavery in certain states and the allowance of slavery in certain states. And Lincoln's famous phrase was, you can't be half slave and half free. Well, that's sort of drawing the line. And a lot of women were involved in that, just like they were in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. But what a lot of women found, at least from what I've read then and in the 60s, is that the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, for them was essentially a male thing. That even though they being the women, had similar ideas, they were relegated to a traditional role. So that brought out an irony where the men were being, quote, progressive, but requiring the women to be traditional. And I think that phenomena back in the 1840s, 1850s, gave birth to the women's movement. That the women's movement decided to separate itself from the abolitionist movement. And 1848, Seneca Falls, is really the birth of the women's movement. And see, that's important to me because it grew out of abolition. And the women's movement didn't declare that the Declaration of Independence was wrong. But what you need to do is to include women specifically in the Declaration and not just say all men are created equal. You need to say all men and women are created equal. And so women wanted to be included within the American story. Whereas like in Europe, 1848 was like, if you look at Karl Marx, is there is a specter haunting Europe, and the specter is communism. So communism was spreading all across Europe, and it was in flames. There was no women's movement or abolitionist movement in Europe. So yes, I think it's part of the American story that the women's movement grew out of the abolitionist movement, and there was another movement which was connected to both but had its own separate identity, the temperance movement. And if you take a look at the leaders of the temperance movement and the leaders of the women's movement, they're pretty much the same. And so that is part of their cleaning up. What the progressives did was to take the women's movement out of not out of the shadows, but they took it out of the private sector, because the women were having their own houses, where you, instead of having a runaway slave, you could have a runaway wife who came to get help. And what the progressives did was to, in effect, abolish that and make it a government program. So the answer is yes, definitely. And it was part of that cleaning up, getting rid. I mean, the progressives really wanted to get rid of sin. And I think that's where women came in. And one of the interesting stories, you see this bundle, which I was saying, the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th Amendment. One of them, we haven't done, you're going to be doing that separately on the equal rights for women to vote. Which is the 19th Amendment, which, by the way, only took about 6 months to pass, which meant that there was, for me, widespread acceptance across the land by that time, that it's about time to be totally inclusive. But what I'm getting at is that when this fall bundle was being first discussed, part of the thought among the leaders of the prohibition movement was they couldn't get prohibition without the women's vote. So should we wait until the women get their vote, then vote, and then put prohibition? So, which shows again that what your point about the temperance movement being linked to the abolitionist movement, the women's movement. It turned out, just by certain chance of the movement and shape of politics, that the prohibition was done in 1817 to 1819, and the women's wasn't introduced until 1919. So that somehow prohibition, this is interesting, prohibition passed without the women's vote, which I find funny. I find just, again, worthy of 10 years of study. It's your project.
That's really interesting, because the men were the ones that were doing all the drinking, and men are the one that passed it. I didn't even put two and two together. Okay, Tova, do you have another question?
Yeah, so I remember learning in school about how a lot of the push for the temperance movement was because they believed that, alcohol increased rates of domestic violence and, violence among men. Was there any evidence or studies done during Prohibition that showed that reducing alcohol actually did decrease domestic violence, or did that not end up being true?
Yeah. I think there's, but in the beginning, in the first early years, there's work has been done. Studies have been shown that drunkenness and the consequences of drunkenness, the public drunkenness and then private behavior, which comes from drunkenness, which went down considerably during the first few years. But here we live in a democracy, which, and we're dealing with it today. You cancel something, or do you compromise with something? And how do you, the prohibition is an attempt to cancel. It's a cancel culture. And one can see the pluses of it. The increasing health. I mean, alcohol, massive consumptions of alcohol leads to a shortening of life, as well as corruption of the family. And so those studies were made, and that's when, in effect, sociology became very attractive to people, going into what is it that affects the ins and outs of society, and what role does drinking play in that? In Britain, for example, there was an attempt during this same period of time to limit the number of pubs that existed between your workplace and your home. Because what was found was that on a Friday, when people got paid, they would spend most of their money in a pub on the way home. So the idea was, if we control the number of pubs, we will increase the ability of people to get home with money in their pocket. But a lot of that is hope rather than reality. So yeah, in the first years, the answer is yes. And then we get into the underground economy. And
did any other countries have a temperance movement around the same time, or was there a push to ban alcohol in any other countries?
That's very good. England did. But part of the American story is the extent to which the temperance movement was here. England didn't have many diverse churches. America had a lot of diverse churches over like one issue or such and such. And temperance became a very big issue. Interesting, there was a pushback. The pushback had to occur in the Catholic and Anglican churches because of the sacrament, where wine is served. And it's not, so one of the interesting things is that since it didn't say going to ban consumption of intoxicating liquors, what happened is that the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church got exemptions to say that a sacramental wine is not intoxicating.
What about Jewish religion, since wine is also there? Do you know about that?
I have not done enough work on the Jewish religion, but I would suspect that this is just my hunch, is that with the powerful movement of the Catholics, especially Sebastiana, all in Northern, this is the time in Northern California when the wine industry started. And it was, a lot of it was sacramental wine. So I wouldn't be surprised at all. I haven't done the work, but I wouldn't be surprised at all that there were exemptions for Jews, and as long as it was sacramental or clearly religious, then what are you going to do? Go into a church and say, or a synagogue and say, I'm sorry, you can't practice that? No, you can't. So people
Okay.
attending mass twice on a Sunday.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so thank you, Tova. And Cathy, go ahead. What are your questions?
Well, thank you for Professor Lloyd. When I was getting ready for this, I read a paper that you had written, and you had a really interesting sentence in there, and I was hoping that maybe you could explain it. You said the 21st Amendment that overturned the 18th Amendment confirmed that we are indeed a commercial federal republic. Can you tell us a little bit about what you meant by that?
Okay, right. Let's start with the word federal, which has so many different meanings. I'm using the word federal in the old-fashioned sense of state-based, that it's in opposition to national, which is one size fits all. So the 21st Amendment, in terms of the federal, returns power to the states. That's what's fascinating about this. Is when would you think that an amendment which gave the federal government power, the general government power, when the general government would give it up? And so prohibition is an example of the working of federalism in the old-fashioned sense of returning power to the states to control something. Now, we might not like that. We might not like the variety that, say, on a Sunday, in Philadelphia, I travel a lot, so I know these rules. It's in Philadelphia airport at 8 a.m. on a Sunday, you can have a beer, but you can't have anything else. In Dallas, you can't have a drink on a Sunday of any kind until noon. So you got, is that prohibition? Well, it is prohibition, but at the state and local level. And what it does is to overturn prohibition at the national level, I make it state and local. Commercial, I mean, and because the language of the 18th Amendment is going back from the 20, the 18th. The 18th Amendment says the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors will be stopped. So if I were to put one word for the manufacture, transportation, and sales, I would use the word commerce. Because that's what commerce is all about. So what you're doing is in effect saying that the way to stop the consumption of alcohol, which is not there, intoxicating liquor, is to impede commerce, manufacture, sale, etc. So Americans during the 1920s still had enough commercial spirit within them that it would create a market, albeit underground. They'd create a sacramental market. They'd create a Jewish market. They'd create all these markets where in the end, it became like who's obeying the law?
Yeah, I love that term, commercial federal republic. Thank you for that. One of our students, Danya Konecki, asked, does any state currently ban intoxicating liquor? Do you know if there's a statewide ban anywhere on intoxicating liquor?
Oh, no, but the 10 states that never ratified, one of them is Mississippi, and I know that Mississippi had, and South Carolina, and they had no drinking laws up until into the 1950s. Certainly South Carolina did. My impression is that they do. Utah, for example, had a considerable control over, but yet it wanted tourism. Now, how are you going to get a tourist to come and sit down there and have a Pepsi? I mean, that's a bit much. I mean, if you want to keep your state as your state, which is Utah, then go ahead and ban intoxicating liquors. It keep you away, but then don't ask for tourism.
Right. Good point.
Right. So I mean, so that gets into. I would say that the states that I know of into the post World War II would be South Carolina, Mississippi, and Utah. But that means to say you couldn't join a quote men's club or a gentleman's club, which is off limits because it's private club. And how much flexibility they have. Like, for example, when I travel, I have a club membership, but the club has to follow the state laws that exist, even if it's at an airport, which is run by the general government with the FAA, and you've got security, which is run by the general government, Homeland Security. The consumption of alcohol is under the control of state laws. Okay. Therefore, even in a private club, at an airport.
Dwayne Horner asks if when the 18th Amendment was passed, was there any thought that it was in direct conflict with the 10th Amendment, since the 10th Amendment said that states reserve all powers except for those officially relegated to the federal government? Or was the 18th adding a power at that point?
Well, I would in fact suggest that the presence of the 10th Amendment meant that you couldn't just simply pass by legislation a law prohibiting, because it's the 10th Amendment. So what you do is you pass an amendment which then carves out an area, which still leaves the 10th Amendment, but it carves out an area which says, we the people by the deliberate sense hereby modify or clarify the 10th Amendment. Well, we could not do it by legislation, precisely for the reason that the student just brought up.
Thank you. And then finally, Tracy asked, could you elaborate just a little bit more on the fact that the 21st Amendment was the only amendment passed by conventions within the states instead of the state legislatures? What was the reason for that? were the state legislatures afraid to take a vote on it? Maybe because of the strength of the temperance movement still, or why did they want to go that convention route just for that amendment?
Well, I think there's in most things in politics and public policy, there's a high ground and a low ground, or sometimes there's even a middle road. I think the low ground has to deal with money and votes, etc. And the idea is, why go back to the state legislature 10 years later, when the state legislatures were the ones who passed prohibition? Do you expect the same people to now change their mind and look weak? The answer is no. Therefore, let's use the alternate one and exclude and give the drinkers a chance, or whatever. I mean, that would be sort of low ground, and there are many shoots that can come out of that. I think the high ground is something that I at least hinted at earlier, which is an amendment to the Constitution becomes part of the Constitution. So that if you are really going to overturn an amendment to the Constitution, which was spoken by the state legislature, then the only real authoritative, completely authoritative source is the people themselves. And for example, how was the US Constitution of 1787 passed? It was passed by having conventions in each state elected by the people for the specific purpose of ratifying or not ratifying the Constitution. And the idea is, if we went to the state legislatures to do it, it would be an imperfect founding. So that to make it a more perfect union, a more perfect founding, you go to the people themselves. And I think that's the reason that that if you're going to overturn an amendment, an amendment has a certain dignity to it. So as we were talking before, an executive order changes an executive order, which changes an executive order. You don't want to get that kind of mentality entering the amendment process. The amendment process is supposed to correct for errors which emerge, or like the Civil War amendments, or like the progressive amendments. What do we do? So there's a bundle there. There's a story, and you're going to sort of change the story of America or alter who's part of that story. You better do it seriously. So that's why I think they went to the people to underscore the importance of that. And I think it lays a precedent for later years that if you want to overturn an amendment to the Constitution, then you got to have the people on your side.
That's great. I never thought of it that way. Well, I think we did it, Janine.
Yeah, I love this final correlation of the founders realized when they'd written the Constitution that if it were to be ratified by the Articles of Confederation Congress, it never would have happened. And so they had to go to the states, the Convention of States, with the state legislatures to actually ratify the Constitution, because the existing Congress certainly wasn't going to do it. They're going to be like, no, it's the same type of correlation with the amendment process. With the pro, it had to go to the Convention of States because the Congress itself probably. The precedent was set within the Constitution to go to the Convention of States to ratify, because they realized you were barking up the same tree, and that's why I love the Convention of States, because it was, and we need to utilize it more, I think.
Well, I think we need to be careful about utilizing it. So because one of the things that an amendment does is to say this generation understands the Constitution better than you will ever understand it the next generation. Because we're laying it down that you can't just simply change the law by a majority vote. You have to go through this complicated process. And so the next generation might say, how dare you? How dare you? And they say, well, we lived through slavery, we lived through the progressives, and we are governing ourselves. And I guess if you, in the 22nd century, want to change all of this, there's a mechanism for you to change it.
I think as I listen to you, which
Yeah.
I could just listen to you all day long. When I listen to you, what I'm and I equate it to my memories and of growing up in Texas and the 50s and the certain, you know, how slowly this 18th Amendment was actually really truly overturned on a federal level within the states. And then I think about my parents and what their conflicts were, and how history now enlightens and this some of the struggles my own parents had, because I'm now seeing things, what you just said, through the eyes of that era. And that's why I believe then that our understanding and our appreciation of it, our reckoning with it, can change when we understand where they were back then.
That's
And
right.
that's why I think history is so important, to understand, you know, where our founders were in the 1700s and how different times were, and as you said, how different times were in the era of the amendments that erased slavery, but just to understand, even with this 18th and 21st Amendment, what it was like, and then what it helps me understand my parents in a different way. So hooray to studying history, which is not done much anymore in our local levels, and to studying the Constitution, which isn't done on the local level. But I know we have to go because Lisa has another job here, and we don't. But Professor Gordon Lloyd, in 60 seconds, I know you're trying to say something. So give us your last 60 seconds for this particular constitutional chat, and we can't wait to have you back for another one. But how you're wanting to say something? So your final lightning round.
I could turn it over to another question. I mean, I don't know that I have the capacity to say something in 60 seconds.
Okay, good. I didn't want you to feel like I was
you're not. You get excited, and the point to a conversation is for me not to give a lecture so much, but to encourage questions, to put something there. And so I don't mind shutting up when somebody else says. I don't look upon it as rude or cutting off when somebody interrupts. They're listening and they want to be part of a conversation.
Yay, Professor Gordon Lloyd! It was really interesting. After you're on as a guest, I just think about it, ruminate upon it for days. I do want to say thank you, Professor Gordon Lloyd. Thank you to our audience. Come back, and then Cathy will tell us next week. Thanks to our sponsor.
Thank you. I want to thank our sponsor for today, Jamie Radke and her husband, John. And thank you to all of our great donors who are on with us today. I see so many of you in our audience. So thank you all for being with us. And thank you, Jamie and John, for sponsoring today's episode.
Thank you for having me. And it's been a joy. And the key word, if people ask me about the American story, is conversation. And I don't particularly care for 1-hour lectures where you just sit there and you listen. I actually encourage, and the fact that Janine thought that she had cut me off is an indication that my method was a success, because all of you, and Janine in particular, has this excitement in her, and that's what we need to revive at schools and in our teachers. It's so sad to see teachers going around without the, without the excitement in their soul. And so I think excitement within one's soul is important, and you folks are doing an incredible job of keeping the story alive.
Well, thank you, Professor Gordon Lloyd. We can't wait till next time. We'll have you back if you'll come again. We would love it.
I tell you something. Ask me next time on a topic that I think I know something about.
Oh, you do a lot of it. You know a lot about everything. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have a great
Bye-bye.
next
Bye-bye.
Tuesday.